Question number 3, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does the Prime Minister still stand by his answer that he will resign if the GCSB has conducted mass surveillance of New Zealanders? If so, what is his definition of mass surveillance?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, yes, and there is no mass surveillance of New Zealanders by the GCSB. To me, mass surveillance would involve surveillance of an entire population or a substantial part of that.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, with regard to his answer that it would involve a significant proportion of the population, is he aware that there have been 1.6 million visits by New Zealanders to the Pacific from 2009 to the current day, whose private communications have been intercepted by the GCSB, and does this not meet the definition that he just gave of mass surveillance?
Order. Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I think the member's making an assumption he shouldn't actually make.
Supplementary question. Order. Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is mass surveillance different to mass collection? If so, how?
Speaker,
right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mass collection is not a term used in the GCSB Act. It would mean different things to different people, but I think people understand what mass surveillance would mean. Mass surveillance is if you surveil an entire population. That does not happen. It's against the law. The GCSB Act makes it quite clear. And in fact, the GCSB Act spells out clearly under what circumstances GCSB can collect information about New Zealanders. It's largely set out in sections 14 and 15B of the Act.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Which one of the Prime Minister's statements is correct? His statement this morning, I don't even know what you mean by mass collection. I've got no clue. It's not a term I've ever seen, nor a term I've ever used, nor his statement in September 2014 when he said there is no mass collection, not of New Zealanders.
Mr. Speaker,
right Honourable Prime Minister.
The point I was making is mass collection is not a term used by GCSB. So it's not a term that I use. That was in relation to a particular issue about spear gun, but it's not a term that GCSB uses.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Will he be straight with New Zealanders? If they travel to the Pacific Islands, will their electronic communications be captured by the GCSB and sent to the NSA or not?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to go through the operational details of the... I'm not going to go through the operational details of the way that GCSB operates, except to say it operates within the law. The law is extremely clear about under what circumstances collection of data could occur about a New Zealander. That is section 14 and 15B. But I will make this exact point. There is absolutely zero change in the way things happen under this government that happened under Helen Clark. So if we want to ask these questions, I'll give you her number in New York and you can give her a ring as well.
Order. There is just too much interchange between both front benches. Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Grant was getting nervous. Is the Prime Minister aware of the statements by Sir Bruce Ferguson that mass collection and mass surveillance are basically the same thing, when Sir Bruce stated on radio, quote, "It's the whole method of surveillance these days, it's mass collection"?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I'm not responsible for the comments that Bruce Ferguson makes. I think the member is actually misrepresenting them, but I go back to the single point. Mass surveillance is not occurring against New Zealanders. It never has. It doesn't matter how many times the member says it. It's simply not true. The law is very clear about what can occur when it comes to New Zealanders, and the law is subject to oversight by the Inspector General. The Inspector General actually makes their findings public in terms of what they do, and there there is no examples that have been brought to my attention where GCSB has acted in breach of the law, with the exception of the Kim.com situation. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't matter how many times that Nikki Hager, the anti-American view and the Green Party want to tell New Zealanders they're being surveilled upon and en masse, they simply are not.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Has it not been brought to his attention that the GCSB are engaged in full-scale collection of all the data coming out of Pacific Island nations, and many hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders have visited or live in those Pacific Island nations during the period that all that data was collected?
Mr. Speaker,
Honourable Prime Minister.
one of the problems when the member wants to rely on stolen information is they get a very, very warped sense of reality. I would have thought, given that the member was part of the ISC committee for 3 years, he would have a basic understanding of the way the GCSB works. The GCSB has to establish a warrant. A warrant has to have a particular reason. The GCSB Act makes it completely clear that information cannot be gathered against New Zealanders, with possible exceptions that are spelled out in sections 14 and 15B of the Act. The Inspector General has total responsibility, complete opportunity and insight to review not only the warrants but the actions of the GCSB. Just because someone goes on a holiday somewhere means absolutely nothing. And it won't matter how many times the member says that, he's simply not right. And I make the point to the members opposite. Nothing has changed under this government to the previous government. If they've got complaints or they don't like things, I'll give you Helen Clark's mobile and give her a call.
No, it's a fair enough.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If mass collection and mass surveillance are two different things, as the Prime Minister has been claiming, what has changed since the Prime Minister admitted on Campbell Live in August 2013, where he said, under the law, to go and look at someone's email is the same as collecting their email?
Speaker.
Right, Honourable
Speaker, well, firstly, the law has changed actually in that time. But Mr. Speaker, well, the law has changed. But Mr. Speaker, mass surveillance of New Zealanders does not happen. There are only, well, the story is exactly the same as when Helen Clark was Prime Minister. I hate to tell you the bad news. Mr. Speaker,
Order.
The question has always been posed by members in the Green Party that mass surveillance of New Zealanders occurs. It does not.
Speaker. Point of order, Mr. Speaker. It's just with regard to the answer.
Order.
It's a pretty specific question, and I don't believe the Prime Minister has addressed it. I was using one of his own quotes.
Order. Part of the question said, what has changed? And the Prime Minister said, well, for one thing, the law has changed. The question was definitely addressed. Order. It is very difficult for me to hear the answers with the constant barrage that's coming from my left-hand side. If it continues, I will have to ask someone to leave the chamber. Question number 4, Jonathan.